Hello and welcome back to this lecture. In this lecture, I am going to be explaining authentication and how authentication works in Django Rest Framework. But before I start working on a Django project, I would like to explain what authentication is. It is quite important that we understand what authentication is before we start implementing it in our applications. So when we have a deep understanding of what authentication is all about, then in implementing it in our application will be much easier and we will know why we are using authentication. It is important to know the reason why we do certain things. So when we know the reason and we have issues understanding the concept, it becomes easier because we know why we are doing it. So the reason why we are doing something, it becomes easier for us to implement or do that stuff. So now let's start by going through the definition of authentication and what authentication really means. Authentication is a process used to verify the identity of a person or entity to ensure they are who they claim to be. It's like showing your ID card to prove that you are the person you say you are. Do you understand that? Authentication isn't permission and isn't authorization. Authentication is different from authorization. Authentication simply ensures that we verify that someone is who they claim to be. In digital systems, authentication involves providing credentials such as username and password to gain access to a protected account or system. These credentials are checked against a stored record to confirm their validity. So now, checking the credential against a stored record means checking the credentials against record we have stored in our database. This is now in a Django instance. If the provided credentials match the stored ones, authentication is successful and access is granted. Authentication methods can vary. Besides username and password, there are other forms of authentication such as fingerprint, face recognition, security tokens or one-time password sent to your phone. This method are an extra layer of security to ensure that only authorized individuals can access information or perform certain actions. In Django, we have security tokens like JWT token and token authentication, and we can also implement some one-time password kind of authentication in Django using some external library and Python OTP. Overall, authentication is a way of confirming someone's identity and allowing them access to the appropriate resources while keeping unauthorized users out. So the main purpose of authentication is granting access to an individual who is a right individual. Who is the right individual? That is, who has created an account or has some particular kind of access to a system, and making sure that only those kind of users can get in. That is what authentication does. Now let's move on to our code editor so we can get started. So now here we are in my code editor. I have a simple Django project. It is a school management system. This is my settings.py and I have a student application within this project. So we have I have set up some things, some basic things like URLs and stuff. So just very basic. So now I have this view, an API endpoint that allows students to view or edit it. So now this, let's go through my serializer.py. This is just a serializer class that is connected to our models, which in our models just contains basic information about a student, their name, grade, age, gender, home address, date and so on. So now currently we don't have any form of authentication in this project. It's just a project without authentication. So now no authentication yet, and our settings.py, when we go to our settings.py, we don't have any globally set method of authentication. So now we are going to be using token authentication and basic authentication. We'll be starting with basic authentication so you can get like a general idea, then we'll move on to token authentication. So now let's head on to our documentation so we can see together how we can implement authentication into our project. So now I said before that we are going to be starting with basic authentication. So basic authentication, this authentication scheme uses HTTP basic authentication signed against a user's username and password. The basic authentication is generally only appropriate for testing. So we can't use this in a real world scenario, but we are just going to be using it to test out what we are doing. If successfully authentication, basic authentication provides request.user will be the Django user instance and request.auth will be none. So unauthenticated responses that are denied will be result in HTTP 401 unauthorized response. So that is about basic authentication. If you use basic authentication in production, you must ensure that your API is only available over HTTPS. You should also ensure that your API client will only request the username and login again. I will never store those details. So now to use basic authentication, we have to define some classes in our settings.py. So we need to copy this over to our settings.py. So here we are, we are using basic authentication, so we need to remove this session authentication, because session authentication is another type of authentication method. So now by doing this, we are setting the entire project, that is, we are telling the entire Django project to use basic authentication as its form of authentication. We are setting it globally. This is what we call global setting. We are setting the authentication method or authentication class globally. We have we also have view based authentication, that is, we set authentication for a particular view. We are going to get to that in this video. At this point, we have added basic authentication to the settings.py, but we don't have any form of permission classes or anything on our views. Let's go to our views. You can see we haven't specified any object level permission class, and we also haven't set any global level permission class. All we have just done is add basic authentication to our settings.py, telling our project that the application will be based on basic authentication. Now let's go to our root URLs. You can see in although I have some Swagger route here, this is for documentation purposes. So but this video is not focused on documentation, so we will just be focusing on this. This is the URL pattern that connects our project to this student application, and that is how the connection is made. So now what I'm saying is that we have a view set that displays every information about students, and we have added basic authentication as our form of authentication using the settings.py through the settings.py. So now what we are doing is, let's run our server now. So I would activate my virtual environment. Conda, this is a virtual environment I use for Django development. So I believe you already have a virtual environment you use to write your Django applications. So mine is called Django env. So conda activate Django env. So a virtual environment is just a way of getting all packages or libraries that you use, modules that you use for a particular type of development. You understand? If for instance you use Flask for web development, you can have a separate virtual environment for Flask modules that you use for development. So each time you want to work with Flask project, you use that virtual environment. And whenever you want to work with Django, for instance, you use your Django virtual environment, which would have all the dependencies needed for a Django application to run. So I have activated my Django environment. Now, what next is to cd into this source file which contains the Django project. So I am in, then I will run python manage.py run server. It's taking a while to load up, but then it's loading. Now I have my server running. I open it on my browser. So we have this. So now this is the API route. Now you can see I can still access every single endpoint and even the browsable API. And when I copy this API endpoint over to Postman, I hope you know what Postman is and you have worked with Postman in previous projects. Postman is a software used to test out APIs. So and I put it here on Postman and I send request, I still get every information I'm meant to get. And that is happening considering the fact that I have added the basic authentication to this application. Now you would find it confusing that why am I not getting stopped? Why can I still access all these endpoints and I am not providing any form of authentication? I'm not providing any form of authentication, what's it called? Any form of authentication like password, username, and I can still access these endpoints without having any issues. That is when permission comes in. As we have read before and as I've explained before, authentication just checks who is coming in and confirms if they have what it takes to come in to a system or to an account. But now let's read about permission, what permission does. So basically, authentication is useless without permission. So permission and authentication works together so we can have a secure system. So now together, permission checks are always run at the very start of the view before any other code is allowed to proceed. Permission checks will typically use the authentication information in the request.user and request.auth properties to determine if the incoming request should be permitted. So now what we have done is that we have added some authentication class, but then we didn't add any permission class. So what is happening is that even if the person that is coming in is a false person or a person that is coming in without any credentials, since permission is not on, then the system will just allow them in because permission with the help of authentication would check if that person is authenticated or is the right person. And when it has determined if the person is the right person, it will now determine if the person should be allowed in, and it will also determine the kind of activities or actions a particular person is permitted to perform. So with the help of permission, we get to know that we get to know if the person is permitted or not. But since we are just letting anybody in now, we can't even know if the person is permitted to take actions or not. So now I will be introducing us to permission. We have a lot of permission classes, but just for the sake of this video, so that I won't have to go over a lot of concepts, so we'll just be using this is authenticated. So now let's read about what this class does. The is authentication permission class will deny permission to any unauthenticated user and allow permission otherwise. That is, it blocks people that are not authenticated and permit only authenticated users. So now let's see how we can add authentication to our application. So it's just by a simple import statement. We can do a an object or API level um permission. We can add it in, and we can also add it globally. So I think we should go with the global option, so that since we don't have much views, we can just do that globally. So we are going to be adding the permission class now. So I hope you understand that authentication is quite useless without permission. So the moment I add this permission class and I save my code, you can see this our project is saving the change I just made now, and I try to access this endpoint again. You can see I get a prompt for username and password, and when I head over to Postman and I send this request again, I get authentication credentials were not provided. Now it looks like it is authentication that is doing the whole work, but don't forget that we could still access all this information before I added the permission class. So what this is to tell us that permission also is quite important, and authentication helps us to identify the user, while permission blocks them depending on their level. Permission is also known as authorization. So now we are not authorized to view this endpoint without providing credentials. So now how do we provide credentials, or how do we supply credentials to our system when we are using the basic authentication class? So to do that, I would first like to create a super user so we can do some certain things. So I have stopped the server. Now let's create a super user. Python manage.py create super user. So this is just a command to create a super user so that I can log into the admin panel. Username would be tester1. Email address, I can leave that blank. This is tester. Then I will enter my password again. Oh, I made a mistake. Okay, yes, I didn't make any mistake. It's saying the password is too similar to the username because I used the password that is very similar. So I have successfully created a super user. So now let's run our server again. Now our server is running, and I would like to log into my admin panel. So using the password, the username and password I created just now, I would be logging in. So I am logged in. So I want to create a user. We can't see the student. I will explain that later. So I want to create a user now, a new user. So let me start by creating a new user. The username should be user1 and the password should be user1 2. Just me trying to create a user so we can use this to test um our authentication and permission. So let me change the password to something a little bit complex. It's rejecting it. It's saying password is too similar. So all I'm doing here is just trying to create a user so we can use this for testing purposes. So now we have two users. We have this tester, which is the super user. We have user1, which is another random user. So now with this, we have two users now. So you might be wondering why we can't find this what is it called, this student model, this model inside the admin panel. The reason is that I have not added it here. So to see models on the admin panel, you have to do something like register your model here. So to do that, you do admin dot site dot register and you import your model into this from dot models import student, which is the model we would like to see in our admin panel, and save. So now when we head over here, we should be able to see our student model. I guess our server is not running yet. Okay, you can see now we have our student model and we can see the two student objects. So now let's get authenticated. Now let's, I am logged in into this panel, into this admin panel as tester. So now don't forget we still have our authentication on. So but now that we have created users, so let's try to provide authentication details and see if we can access this endpoint as an authenticated user. So to test that out, so let's send a request again just to see that it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We still have these authentication credentials were not provided. So to provide authentication credentials, we have to go into this headers tab and search authentication. Authorization. Authorization. Then add this here. So now our authorization is, so to know what to do here, I know what to do, but like I would like to show you, let's head over to the documentation and look for authentication. So we are using basic authentication. So it is telling us that unauthentication responses that are denied by permission will result in 401 unauthorized response. So to provide authentication, you need to do this you need to add this in your header. So to add this, you have to write in this authorization bar, we will now write basic. When we write basic, then followed by our username and password. So my username was tester1 and I used tester1 2004 as my password. So we have that in our header now. So let's try sending request. You can see we got invalid basic header, credentials not correctly base64 encoded. So basically what this is telling us that we have provided the header, or we have provided some form of authentication information in our header, but the credentials are not correctly in base64. That is, if we want to provide credential what's it called, authorization credentials in our header using basic authentication, they have to be encoded in 64, in base 64. So now to do that, we are going to be using a website called base64encode.com. So that we put what we want to encode here and we click convert, then it has converted this our username and password to base64. Now we copy this and we put this over here. This is just us trying to provide authentication details like our username and password using the basic authentication. So now with that we get invalid username and password. I think I copied the wrong thing over here. So tester. Okay, there was a space at the back of that tester1. So now let me recover it. So that space alone determines a lot. So now let's copy this over and put it back on postman. So there is a space between the basic and the actual base64 encoded format we have. You can see there's a space there. So we send it again. Now you can see we can access all our information and we can see them again. So this is to tell us that basic authentication, we just use basic authentication to protect our application. But don't forget, from the documentation we were told that we should not use this in actual production environment, that which is appropriate for testing only. So now with that, I hope you now have a basic understanding of how basic authentication works and how authentication generally works in Django. So let's try to access the endpoint again using the browsable API. Now it's asking us for a prompt now. Then when we provide it here to tester1 and the password tester1 2004, so we are able to view this page again. See, and it shows up here that we are signed in as this particular person. So but don't forget that before we added that permission classes, we could not do all this signing in and entering password and all of that. So basically authentication just allows us in regardless of who we are. But with the help of permission now checks what authentication has done. So when permission now tries to tell authentication that okay, this person is not authenticated or is not even providing any form of credential, then permission tells authentication to make sure this person is authenticated before they can view this particular view or page. So that is how authentication and permission work hand in hand. So you can see authentication alone can't do all of the work. It needs permission to carry out all these actions. I hope this lecture has been helpful and I hope you've learnt a lot. See you next time.